I mean, he had his hand on the gun, actually. And he comes over and said, "What?"
At 85, Mario Andretti doesn't talk about hate like most people do, because in Formula One, hate isn't loud, it isn't emotional, it's quiet. It builds lap after lap, corner after corner, and it comes from one place only: the moment you realize the race is no longer yours. The drivers he hated the most were not the fastest, not the ones who made headlines, but the ones who got inside his rhythm and slowly took it away from him. The ones who made him hesitate for half a second, break a fraction earlier than he wanted, turn in without full commitment, and once that starts happening, you feel it immediately. You're no longer driving freely. You're reacting, adjusting, chasing something you used to control. That's what he couldn't stand, not losing position, but losing authority over the race itself. Because for a driver like Andretti, the worst feeling wasn't being beaten, it was knowing someone else was dictating everything around you and there was nothing you could do to stop it. Number 5, Emerson Fittipaldi. The first driver I want to talk about is Emerson Fittipaldi, and this is where it starts to get uncomfortable, because Fittipaldi was never the kind of driver who overwhelmed you with raw aggression. He didn't come at you with wild moves or desperate lunges. Instead, he did something far more difficult to deal with. He controlled the race without ever making it look like a fight. When you were on track with him, everything felt calm at first. The pace was steady, the gaps were predictable, nothing seemed out of place, and that's exactly what made him dangerous. Because while you were settling into your rhythm, thinking you had the race under control, he was quietly shaping it around you. There were races in the early 70s where Andretti would feel strong. The car responding, the lines clean, everything building the way it should, and then Fittipaldi would be there, not pushing, not forcing anything, just staying within reach, always in the right position, always managing his tires, always keeping the pressure just high enough that you couldn't ignore him. And that's where the problem began, because he didn't force mistakes directly, he made you create them yourself. You'd start pushing a little harder than planned, braking a touch later, getting on the throttle a fraction too early. Not because you had to, but because you felt like you might lose control of the race if you didn't. What made Fittipaldi so difficult wasn't speed, it was discipline. His ability to stay within his limits while quietly pulling you outside of yours. And once that shift happened, once you were no longer driving at your pace but reacting to his presence, the race had already changed. Andretti didn't lose control all at once against drivers like him. It slipped away gradually, lap after lap, decision after decision, until suddenly you realize you're no longer dictating anything. You're chasing a race that used to belong to you. And that's why Fittipaldi was on this list, because he didn't need to attack you to take control. He just waited, stayed precise, stayed patient, and let you beat yourself, trying to keep up with a race he was already managing better than anyone else on the track. Number 4, Niki Lauda. The next driver I want to talk about is Niki Lauda, and this is where things change completely, because with Lauda, it never felt like a race in the traditional sense. It felt like you were being studied, measured, and slowly boxed into a first sensation situation you didn't even realize you were entering. There was nothing chaotic about him, nothing unpredictable, no sudden aggression that gave you a clear signal to react. Instead, everything he did was controlled, deliberate, and always one step ahead of what you were thinking in that moment. When Andretti lined up against Lauda in the late 70s, especially during the peak years of Ferrari versus Lotus, the difference wasn't always visible in outright pace, because on certain days, Andretti had the faster car the better, balanced the cleaner lines through the corners, but Lauda had something else, something much harder to deal with. He understood the race as a complete system, not just lap by lap, not just corner by corner, but as a long sequence of decisions that all connected to each other. And once you were inside that system, you were no longer driving freely, you were reacting to a structure he had already built. There were races where Andretti would push early, trying to establish control, building a gap, setting a rhythm that forced everyone else to follow, and Lauda wouldn't respond immediately. He wouldn't chase, he wouldn't take unnecessary risks. He would stay within himself, managing tires, managing fuel, managing every input with precision, and from the outside it looked like he was simply maintaining position. But what he was really doing was waiting for the race to come to him, waiting for the exact moment when the conditions shifted just enough to turn the pressure back around. And that's where it became difficult, because against most drivers, when you push, you get a reaction. You see the effect, you feel the pressure transfer. But with Lauda, there was no visible reaction, no sign that what you were doing was working, and that creates doubt. Small at first, but it grows. You start questioning whether you're pushing too hard, whether you're using too much tire, whether you're committing too early in certain corners, and once those questions enter your head, you're no longer fully committed to your own race. Lauda didn't force mistakes in the obvious way. He didn't dive down the inside or pressure you into defensive lines. He let the race unfold in a way that made you uncomfortable with your own decisions. And when the moment finally came, when the tires started to drop, when the track conditions changed, when the balance shifted just slightly, he was ready, not because he reacted faster, but because he had already anticipated it long before it happened. For Andretti, that was one of the most frustrating things to deal with because you couldn't point to a single moment where you lost control. There was no clear mistake, no obvious turning point. It just slipped away. The race stopped, feeling like yours, and suddenly you were chasing a result that had already been shaped by someone else's understanding of the bigger picture. That's why Lauda was different, because you weren't just racing a driver, you were racing a mind that had already calculated the race before it fully unfolded. And once you were inside that calculation, the control you thought you had was never really yours to begin with. Number 3, James Hunt. The next driver I want to talk about is James Hunt, and this is where control doesn't just slip away, it disappears completely. Because with Hunt, there was no structure to rely on, no predictable rhythm to settle into, nothing you could study or prepare for in the usual way. Everything about him felt unstable, not because he didn't know what he was doing, but because he chose to operate in a space where control itself was constantly shifting, and that made him one of the most difficult drivers to face if your strength came from precision and rhythm, the way Andretti's did. When you raced against Hunt, the first thing you noticed was that he didn't follow patterns. He didn't build his race the way most drivers did. There was no gradual progression, no steady increase in pressure. Instead, he could go from calm to aggressive in a single lap, from sitting behind you to attacking from a position you didn't expect, and that unpredictability forced you into a different kind of mindset, one where you were no longer executing a plan. You were constantly reacting to something that could change at any moment. There were races in the mid-70s where Andretti would feel in control early on the car, responding cleanly, the lines consistent, everything aligned with how he wanted to manage the race, and then Hunt would appear not necessarily faster, over a full stint, but sharper in isolated moments, willing to take risks in places where most drivers would wait, braking later into corners where the margin for error was almost non-existent. Positioning the car in ways that disrupted the natural racing line, forcing Andretti to either back out or commit to something that didn't feel right. And that's where the pressure started to build, not from sustained pace, but from constant disruption, because every time you think you've stabilized the race, Hunt changes the situation again. He resets the terms, and suddenly the side reference points you were using, braking markers, entry speeds, exit lines, they don't apply the same way anymore. You start second-guessing your decisions, wondering if you're being too cautious or if pushing harder will only play into his hands, and that hesitation, even if it's just a fraction of a second, is enough to shift the balance. What made Hunt so difficult was that he forced you out of your comfort zone repeatedly, not with a long-term strategy like Lauda, but with moment-to-moment pressure that never allowed you to settle, and for Andretti, who thrived on building a race on establishing control through consistency and precision, that kind of environment was the exact opposite of what he needed to perform at his best. There were moments where Andretti would try to impose his own structure back onto the race, trying to reset the pace to bring things back into a predictable flow, but Hunt wouldn't allow it. He would attack again from a different angle, at a different time, breaking the rhythm just as it started to form. And over time, that constant interruption wears you down, not physically but mentally, because you're never fully in command of what's happening. That's why Hunt belongs on this list, because he didn't just challenge Andretti's speed, he challenged his ability to control the race itself, and in a sport where control is everything, facing someone who refuses to play within any stable structure means you're always one step away from losing it, completely. Number 2, Jackie Stewart. The next driver I want to talk about is Jackie Stewart, and this is a completely different kind of pressure, because with Stewart, nothing ever felt out of place, nothing felt chaotic, nothing felt unpredictable, and that was exactly the problem, because when everything is perfect, when every corner is taken the way it should be, when every lap is consistent, you don't get opportunities, you don't get openings, and slowly you realize there is nothing you can attack. Racing against Stewart wasn't about reacting to sudden moves or unexpected aggression. It was about facing a level of precision that never gave you a reason to believe you could take control back. When Andretti lined up against Stewart in the early 70s, he was facing a driver who understood something fundamental about Formula One, that control is built through consistency, not moments, and Stewart executed that idea better than anyone else at the time. Lap after lap, corner after corner, he placed the car exactly where it needed to be, never overdriving, never underdriving, always within that narrow window where the car was at its most efficient, and from the outside it didn't look overwhelming. There was no dramatic movement, no visible struggle, but inside the cockpit it felt suffocating because no matter how hard you pushed, the gap didn't change in a way that gave you hope. Andretti was a driver who could build momentum, who could take a race and gradually bend it to his will, increasing pressure, finding small advantages, turning them into larger ones over time. But against Stewart, that process never really started because there was no weakness to build on. You could push harder into the braking zones, carry more speed through the corners, try to find a different line, but Stewart was always there, not reacting, not adjusting in a visible way, just maintaining a level that forced you to keep searching for something that didn't exist. And that's where the frustration grew, not from losing positions, but from the feeling that nothing you were doing was changing the situation, because in racing, you rely on feedback. You rely on the sense that if you push something will happen. Either you gain time or you make a mistake. But with Stewart, you could push lap after lap and the result felt the same. And over time, that consistency starts to work against you. It makes you question whether you're pushing in the right places, whether you're managing the car correctly, whether you're missing something obvious. There were races where Andretti would try to break that pattern, trying to force a different dynamic, pushing the car closer to its limits, taking risks in corners where normally he would stay controlled. And that's exactly where Stewart's strength became even more apparent, because he didn't need to respond to those risks. He didn't need to match them. He simply stayed within his range, knowing that over time, the driver pushing harder would be the one to pay the price, either through tire degradation, small errors, or simply losing the balance needed to sustain that level of intensity. What made Stewart so difficult to deal with was that he didn't take control away from you in a dramatic way. He removed your options one by one until all that was left was a race where you were no longer making decisions. You were just trying to find something that could change the outcome. And when nothing worked, that's when you understood the real problem. You weren't losing because you were slower. You were losing because you couldn't break his control. That's why Stewart stands this high on the list, because facing him meant accepting that perfection doesn't give you an opening. And when there is no opening, there is no way to take the race back, no matter how fast you believe you are. Number 1, Jody Scheckter. And the last driver I want to talk about is Jody Scheckter. And this is where control doesn't just fade away or slip through your hands. This is where it gets taken from you directly, aggressively, and without giving you a moment to reset, because Scheckter was not interested in managing the race from a distance or waiting for it to come to him. He stepped into your space, he forced the issue, and he made every decision feel rushed, whether you wanted it or not. When Andretti faced Scheckter in the late 70s, especially during those tight wheel-to-wheel battles, the difference was immediate. You could feel it from the first few laps, because Scheckter didn't give you the comfort of building your race. He didn't sit back and let you establish rhythm. He challenged you early, positioning his car in places that forced you to react, cutting off lines before they fully opened, making you think twice about committing to corners you would normally take without hesitation. And that constant interference changed everything. Andretti was at his best when he could flow through a race, linking corners together, building speed, gradually controlling the pace from the front, or managing pressure from behind. But against Scheckter, that flow never really existed, because every time it started to form, it got interrupted, not subtly, like with Fittipaldi, not strategically like with Lauda, but physically directly in a way that forced immediate decisions, and those decisions were rarely comfortable ones. There were moments where Andretti would try to assert control, pushing harder, trying to reclaim track position, but Scheckter would be there, not just defending, but shaping the space itself, placing his car in a way that made overtaking feel risky even when the opportunity was there, forcing Andretti into lines that compromised exit speed, breaking the natural rhythm of the lap. And once that rhythm was broken, it became harder and harder to rebuild it. What made Scheckter so difficult was his ability to apply pressure without giving you time to process it. Because in racing, even a small window to think, to adjust, to reset your approach can make a difference. But against him, that window didn't exist. Everything was immediate. Every corner required a decision. Every straight required awareness. And over time, that constant demand starts to wear you down. Not physically, but mentally. Because you're always one step behind the situation instead of ahead of it. And that's where mistakes begin. Not because you lack skill, not because the car isn't capable, but because you're no longer operating on your terms, you're reacting to someone else's presence, someone else's positioning, someone else's control of the space around you. And once that shift happens, even the smallest error can become the defining moment of the race. For Andretti, that was the hardest thing to accept, because he was a driver who believed in controlling the race, in dictating the pace, in shaping the outcome through precision and confidence. But against Scheckter, that control was constantly under threat, not in a distant, calculated way, but right there, in every corner, in every decision, in every attempt to take the race back. That's why Scheckter stands at the top of this list, because he didn't just challenge Andretti's ability, he challenged his authority over the race itself. And in a sport where control defines everything, facing someone who refuses to give you that control, who forces you into mistakes simply by being where you don't want him to be, is the kind of experience that stays with you long after the race is over, because you know deep down that on that day, you weren't the one deciding how the race would be run. What makes this list so different is that none of these drivers beat Mario Andretti in the same way, and that's exactly the point. Because in Formula One, you don't lose control in one moment, you lose it in layers, and each of these drivers stripped something away from him in a different way. Emerson Fittipaldi took his sense of timing, forcing him to push when he didn't need to. Niki Lauda took his ability to read the race, always staying one step ahead, in a way that couldn't be countered in real time. James Hunt took away structure, completely turning the race into something unpredictable, where control had no stable meaning. Jackie Stewart removed opportunity itself, leaving no space, no weakness, no opening to take advantage of. And Jody Scheckter, more than anyone else, took the race out of his hands directly, forcing him into decisions that were never fully his own. And when you look at it that way, you start to understand something deeper about what Andretti meant when he talked about hate, because it was never about personalities, never about conflict off the track. It was about those moments inside the cockpit where you realize the race is slipping away and you can't trace it back to a single mistake. You can't fix it with one adjustment. You can't take it back with one move. It's already gone, shaped by someone else's control, someone else's understanding of how to dictate everything happening around you. That's what made these drivers so difficult, and that's why they stayed with him, because long after the race ends, long after the results are recorded, what you remember isn't who finished ahead, it's who made you feel like you were no longer in charge of your own race. And for a driver like Mario Andretti, there was nothing worse than that.